What I'm about to share, most people have never heard described this way. Unless you have studied neuroscience, hypnosis, or interrogation, this framing will likely be completely new to you. And I want to start with something that sounds simple but is actually one of the most important things you will hear tonight. Emotions do not have an expiration date. They do not work themselves out. They do not fade with time simply because time has passed. Here is what that actually means. If something happened to you 5 years ago, 15 years ago, or when you were 7 years old and you did not fully process the emotion attached to that experience, it did not disappear. It did not quietly resolve itself while you were busy living your life. You are still carrying it. Right now. Tonight. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of what is literally happening inside your nervous system at this very moment. Here is what no one tells you. The nervous system runs an open tab. Every emotion that was swallowed instead of felt, every grief that got skipped over, every rage that got smiled through. It all went somewhere. And wherever it went, it started accumulating interest. That chest tightness you explained away as stress? Interest? That disproportionate reaction last Tuesday that you still cannot fully explain? Interest? The exhaustion that sleep never quite fixes? Interest. This is the central thesis of everything that follows tonight. Every unprocessed emotion becomes a line of credit, and your nervous system has been silently paying interest on that credit for years, possibly decades, without you ever seeing the statement. The terrifying part is not the debt itself. The terrifying part is that most people have been making payments their entire adult lives without ever knowing there was a balance due. They just thought that was life. They thought that was them. So let's give this thing a name. What we call personality is often just a collection of unpaid invoices from childhood. Think about that for a moment. The person who cannot wait, who snaps at slow drivers, who interrupts mid-sentence, who feels their skin crawl when things don't move fast enough. We say that person is impatient. We call it a temperament. But impatience is not a temperament. It is a bill that hasn't been paid. The person who cannot stop working, who fills every hour, who feels vaguely criminal when they rest. We call that ambition. But that need to stay constantly busy is not ambition. It is a payment being made on something. The person who cannot sit in silence and who needs noise, a screen, something. We call that a preference. It is not a preference. It is avoidance of a creditor. The title of tonight's lecture is Emotional Debt. Now let's talk about what is actually happening inside the body when this occurs. When something emotionally significant happens and the nervous system doesn't get to complete its response, the charge of that emotion doesn't simply fade away. It gets stored. Specifically, it gets stored in subcortical structures, the amygdala, the insula, the brainstem, and the body itself. These are ancient parts of the nervous system operating far below conscious awareness. And here is what makes this so important. These experiences are not stored as memories. They are stored as states. That distinction is everything. A memory is something you can recall from a distance. You can think about it, analyze it, place it in time. A state is something you re-enter. You don't remember it, you become it again. That is the difference between knowing something happened and suddenly being back inside it as if no time has passed at all. Here is what that actually looks like in a real human life. A 45-year-old sits in a boardroom meeting. Someone raises their voice slightly, it's not even at them. And suddenly, without warning, their hands are shaking. Their chest is tight. They feel 7 years old, and they have absolutely no explanation for it. That is not a memory. That is a re-entry. The nervous system did not retrieve a file. It loaded a state. It went back inside the experience, because that experience never finished. When a threat occurs, the autonomic nervous system mobilizes. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The body prepares to act. And here is the critical part. If that response completes, the charge dissipates. The system returns to baseline. The animal shakes it off and walks away. The human, however, is rarely allowed to complete the response. And that is where everything starts going wrong. But what happens when the response cannot complete? A child cannot fight back against a parent. Cannot run because that house is their only home. Cannot cry because crying gets punished with more pain. So the mobilization begins and then stops mid-cycle, with nowhere to go. That energy does not vanish, it locks into the body. It becomes tight shoulders that never fully drop. Chronic jaw pain with no dental explanation. Stomach problems that every specialist calls stress. A baseline hum of anxiety so constant, so familiar, that it stops feeling like a symptom and starts feeling like a self. People say, that is just how I am. Anxious, guarded, closed off, tightly wound. But that is not personality. That is storage. That is the body holding an incomplete response from decades ago, still waiting for permission to finish. That is the biological foundation of emotional debt. Now here is where emotional debt starts showing up neurologically, and this is where it gets undeniable. The first effect is amygdala hypersensitization. Over time, with enough unprocessed emotional charge stored in the system, the amygdala literally lowers its threshold for activation. It takes less and less to set someone off. A slightly off tone in someone's voice ruins the entire day. A look that feels dismissive sends the whole system into threat response. People around them might call it oversensitivity, but that is not weakness, that is accumulating interest on an unpaid balance. The third effect involves the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. When emotional debt accumulates, this system stays permanently switched on, keeping cortisol chronically elevated. Not in dramatic spikes, but in a quiet background hum that never fully quiets down. That sustained elevation suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep architecture, impairs memory consolidation, increases visceral fat storage, and accelerates cellular aging at the telomere level. Emotional debt does not just make someone feel bad, it literally ages them. It makes them sick in ways that no doctor ever connects back to the original source. The fourth effect is perhaps the most insidious. Unprocessed emotions become a recruiting agent. They begin pulling in relationships, career choices, daily habits, and entire identity structures into the payment plan. Slowly, everything reorganizes itself around the debt. And from the outside, from everyone watching, it just looks like personality. It looks like who they are. Now let's talk about how people actually manage this debt day to day, because everyone has a strategy even if they have never called it that. The first and most common is numbing. Alcohol, weed, scrolling, food, shopping, binge-watching. These are not done out of deep enjoyment. They are done because feeling nothing is cheaper than feeling everything owed. And here is the part nobody wants to hear. It works. That is exactly why it is so hard to stop. This is not a discipline problem. This is not a character flaw. This is a successful short-term debt management strategy. The nervous system found something that lowers the interest payment for a few hours, and it is not going to give that up without a very good reason. The second strategy is performing, becoming the funniest person in the room, the most charming, the most helpful, most agreeable, most fine. That is also servicing a debt. Every laugh earned, every need anticipated, every I'm okay delivered on cue, that is a payment being made. And then there is loneliness. Not the kind where nobody is around, the kind where everyone is around and no one truly knows who you are. You are at the dinner table, at the party, in the relationship, surrounded by people who think they know you. And you are completely alone inside it. That is the most expensive loneliness possible, because at least when nobody is around, you know why it hurts. This kind has no explanation and no exit. And then there is the relational overfunctioner. The person who cannot stop giving, who anticipates every need before it is spoken, bends over backwards, fills every silence, fixes every problem. They believe that is love. They have always believed that is love. It is not love. It is debt servicing. It is someone who learned very early that their presence alone was never enough, and has been making payments on that belief ever since. Here is where emotional debt gets deeply relational. Your nervous system does not attract what you want. It attracts what it recognizes, and that distinction will rearrange how you understand every significant relationship in your life. If love came packaged with anxiety in your earliest years, you will feel most alive around people who make you anxious. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because your nervous system reads that anxiety as confirmation. This feels like love. This must be real. If closeness came with control, you will feel safest with people who dominate you. If affection came with conditions, you will grow up believing the only love worth having is love that must be earned through performance. And here is the part that costs people decades. You will walk directly past the person offering you genuine peace, not because you do not want peace, but because peace does not feel familiar enough to feel real. Now here is something important to understand, because people often confuse these two things. Trauma is an event, something that breaks through the system's capacity to cope entirely. You can point to it, name it, locate it on a timeline. That is trauma. Emotional debt is different. It is not one event, it is 1,000 small moments where something was felt and never finished. Needing to be angry and learning that anger was not safe in this house. Being 6 years old and having to grieve something real while being told to look strong. Needing to simply be a child while being quietly made into the adult in the room. None of those moments would qualify as clinical trauma. No diagnosis would be attached to them. But every single one of them created debt. Because the emotion arrived, the body mobilized, and then the response was interrupted. The charge had nowhere to go, so it stayed, and it has been collecting interest ever since. Now here is where something important needs to be said, because this is the part where people either move toward understanding or get stuck in blame. Your parents probably did their best. That sentence is not a defense of harm, it is a structural observation. They were in debt themselves, whatever they could not give you. The emotional attunement, the safety, the permission to feel, they could not give it because they never received it either. Their parents handed them a balance, and their parents received one before that. They did not sit down one day and decide to pass something broken forward. They simply could not give what was never deposited into their own account. So the balance transferred, quietly, without a signature, without anyone knowing a transaction had occurred. That balance is now sitting in your account. This is not about excusing anyone. It is about understanding the mechanism, because blame keeps you inside the debt. Understanding is the first movement towards standing outside of it. And when a system carries more debt than it can service, it eventually reaches a threshold. That threshold has a name. There is a threshold in financial systems where the payments can no longer cover the interest, where the minimum due exceeds what is available, where the structure itself begins to fail. That threshold has a name: bankruptcy. Emotional systems have the exact same threshold. When someone hits it, it rarely looks like one clean moment. It looks like a breakdown that seems to come from nowhere. A health crisis that the body has been building toward for years. An identity collapse where someone wakes up and genuinely does not know who they are or why they kept going this long. People call this weakness, they call it failure. It is neither. It is what happens when a system has been servicing compounding debt for decades without ever once addressing the principle. The interest finally exceeded the income. The structure did what structures do when they are never repaired. It came down. This is where the diagnosis ends. Now we talk about what actually moves the debt. So what is the active ingredient in everything that actually works? Therapy, somatic work, TRE, psychedelics, breathwork, meditation, they all look completely different on the surface. Different rooms, different techniques, different languages. But underneath every single one of them, when they actually produce change, there is one shared mechanism. Perspective, not positivity, not reframing, not looking on the bright side or reminding yourself that someone somewhere has it worse. That is not what is being described here. This is a mechanical shift in vantage point, moving from inside the pattern to above it. When therapy works, it is not the advice. It is the moment something gets said out loud and heard from outside the self for the very first time. Imagine living inside a story for 30 years. Every decision, every reaction, every relationship filtered through that story. And then suddenly, for just one moment, you are looking at the story instead of from within it. That is the entire mechanism. That is the active ingredient. Here is where it gets genuinely cruel. The debt itself actively prevents you from gaining the one thing that could resolve it. Think about that for a moment. The very condition you are trying to escape is the condition that blocks the exit. The avoidance, the numbing, the busyness, the caretaking. Every single one of those strategies is a defense mechanism against perspective. They work by keeping you inside the pattern, inside the story, inside the activation. Because the moment you slow down enough to gain perspective, you have to feel what you have been running from. So the strategies used to manage the debt are the exact same strategies that keep the debt locked in place. This is precisely why willpower alone never works. Deciding to be different changes nothing about the structure underneath. Understanding the architecture of the debt is not optional preparation. It is the necessary first step before any real resolution can begin. So how do you actually begin resolving this? There are 5 steps, and the first 2 are about awareness. Step 1 is seeing the payments. Not the original event, you don't need that. You only need to notice what is happening right now. The disproportionate reaction to a slightly critical email. The predictable avoidance of quiet evenings. The way rest feels dangerous, like something bad will happen if you slow down. The inability to sit in silence without reaching for your phone. The unexplained tightness in your chest that has no story attached. These are not personality quirks. These are payments being made on a debt you didn't consciously take out. Step 2 is naming the behavior, without judgment and without trying to stop it, just name it. I am numbing right now. I am performing right now. That is enough. Because naming creates distance. And distance is not a small thing. Distance is where every single choice you have ever made actually lives. You cannot choose from inside the pattern. You can only choose from above it. Step 3 is letting the body finish what it started. The emotions stored inside you are not memories. They are incomplete motor responses. The scream that stayed in the throat. The collapse that was never surrendered to. The body needs to finish these physically, not intellectually. Shaking, tremoring, crying without a story attached. Not analysing why, just allowing the movement to complete. But here is the critical part. This must be done from the shifted vantage point, not from inside the activation. Observing the wave, not drowning in it. Step 4 is stopping the accumulation of new debt. When something is felt, give it just 10 seconds. Let it land. Do not immediately reach for the phone, the drink, the distraction. 10 seconds. That is the entire practice. Because when the nervous system learns that feelings are allowed to arrive, that they will not destroy you, it stops storing them. It stops opening new accounts. The interest stops compounding. Step 5 is getting a witness. And this one matters more than most people expect. Much of emotional debt was created in isolation. The aloneness itself is part of the debt. You felt something enormous and there was no one there. Or worse, someone was there and they looked away. The discharge process often needs a witness, not someone to fix it, not someone to advise or reframe or rush you through it, someone who can simply sit with you while something moves through your body without trying to make it stop. Their presence creates a perspective that is almost impossible to generate alone. When someone holds space without flinching and without fixing, they become a mirror. And in that mirror you can finally see what has been moving through you without being completely consumed by it. You can watch it instead of becoming it. That is what most people needed at age 5 and never received. Not solutions, just someone who could stay. No one chose their debt. It was opened by circumstances beyond control at an age when nothing could be understood. The payments have been made ever since. The tight smiles, the I'm good, the sleepless nights, the collapsed relationships with no clear explanation. Tonight was never about fixing anything. It was about shifting the vantage point. The debt is not the enemy. The fixed position inside the debt is the enemy. Move the vantage point and the debt starts to move with it. Because when the vantage point shifts, the question shifts with it. It stops being why am I messed up? It becomes what do I owe? And then, how do I start paying it back? Not all at once, not perfectly, not without setbacks, but consciously, with eyes open, from above the pattern instead of inside it. That is perspective shifting, and it is the beginning of everything.